And when Andrew and I talked about this session, when I was deciding a title, I decided that I would speak on Buddhism and women, the positive story. Although there's a negative background, but Buddhism and women, the positive story. And for the last 30 years or so, I've been traveling alongside many Buddhist women, both in the West and in Sri Lanka. And I'm going to begin with where it all began, really, for me. Oh, gosh, no. Yes, we got it right. With an international conference of Buddhist nuns in Bodh Gaya, India, in 1987. It was a pioneering conference, and it was organized by three prominent Buddhist women. Two are shown on the rather old picture here, but it does go back to 1987. On your right, Dr. Chatsuman Kapil Singh, she then was a Thai academic and Buddhist woman, and on her left, Venerable Karma Lekshi Somo, who an American convert to Buddhism, who ordained in the Tibetan tradition. And the third organizer, this is a later photograph, not 1987, Venerable Ayya Khema, someone who was born into the Jewish community in Germany and became a Buddhist nun later in her life, and at the time of the conference was in Sri Lanka. Now, that conference in 1987 was my first experience of the power, energy, and excitement of Buddhist women together. I was in Sri Lanka at the time studying Buddhism. I was persuaded to go to the conference by another powerhouse, Hema Gunatilaka, who had been doing some work on women's ordination in Buddhism, and in that context had visited China to see if the nuns there were following the same rule of discipline. And so my presentation today starts with the Bodh Gaya conference and then moves backwards into the beginnings of the Buddhist tradition and forwards into the present. Now, why was that conference in 1987 so important? First, there was quite a lot of lack of communication and a lack of understanding between women across different Buddhist schools. And the two main schools in Buddhism are Theravada, which is present in countries such as Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Sri Lanka, and Mahayana Buddhism, which has an eastern wing in China and Japan, and a northern kind of wing in Mongolia, Tibet, Bhutan, and so on. And there was not a lot of understanding between women across the world. And in some Theravada countries, higher ordination for women had been lost. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, there is a distinction between monastics and lay people, a very important distinction. And I'll say more about that later. But the loss of higher ordination for women in Theravada countries. There were also divisions between Western converts to Buddhism and Asian Buddhist women. And in all the contexts in which the women came, there was a struggle against patriarchy, conservatism, male domination, and so on. So just keeping that 1987 conference in the background, I want to look backwards, the positive in the Buddhist tradition. Now, we know that the historical Buddha, who lived in the 5th century BCE, allowed women to become monastics. In other words, to be equal to men in the most holy sphere of following the Buddha. Allowed women to become bhikshunis in Sanskrit, bhikkhunis in Pali. And within the Pali canon of texts, there is a book called the Therigatha, which literally means the verses of the early nuns. It's a section of the Khuddaka Nikaya of the Sutta Pitaka of the Pali canon. And this book has two sections. There's one small section in which you get the voice of the historical Buddha urging women to reach the highest. And then there's a section which gives the verses of the nuns speaking about their experience, speaking about the fact that some of them had reached nirvana. And it's a book that illustrates that enlightenment is possible for women. It's not genders. It's equality. And this is just one of the nuns that are present in the Telegata Uttara. And to translate her verse, or one or part of her poem, it would be, well have I disciplined myself in act, in speech, and also in thought, rapt and intent, craving with root of craving is overcome, who am I now? I know Nibbana's peace. Someone who had reached enlightenment present in what some scholars have said is one of the earliest examples of women's literature, Telegata. And then also in the Pali canon, which is the canon of texts which unite Theravada Buddhism, there are discourses given by women. The Trilavela Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the nun Dharmadina actually preaches to her former husband, Visakha, about things that are central to the Buddhist teaching, the Eightfold Path and feelings, etc. And the Buddha said at the end, clever Visakha is the nun Dharmadina. Of great wisdom Visakha is the nun Dharmadina. If you had asked me, Visakha, about this matter, I too would have answered exactly as the nun Dharmadina answered. You always had to have that at the end of the discourse to give credibility to the fact that the woman had given the discourse, and the Buddha is brought in to say, well, this is the Buddha's word. This woman is teaching exactly as I would teach. Taught side. Now, that kind of positive heritage was lost in the Buddhist tradition. Negative images of Buddhism crept into the texts, and some women believe these negative images were kind of later additions as the text became edited and so on. The order of nuns was taken to countries such as Sri Lanka, but was lost, and in some countries it was never transmitted at all. Buddhist authority structures throughout the world became dominated by men, except if you look at Taiwan and Korea in the present. In Taiwan, there are more, for instance, Buddhist nuns than there are Buddhist monks. Economic reasons behind this. The men want to go into business and that kind of thing, and it's often the women who want to renounce, and then many are involved in social service and engage Buddhism. But yes, in many Buddhist contexts, there's still patriarchy. And before the 1990s, only Mahayana countries offered this higher ordination for women. In other words, you've got novice ordination. Higher ordination is where nuns follow up to 311 rules of discipline. And so before the 1990s, Taiwan, China, Japan, Vietnam, Korea offered higher ordination. Tibet, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and other countries did not. So things were lost. And this is an example of I would call a negative text from the Pali Canon about women. This is what the Buddha, these are words that were placed in the Buddha's mouth as the texts were edited. Monks, women end their life unsated and unreplete with two things. What two? Sexual intercourse and childbirth. These are the two things. Very negative. And you've got other texts like that. And were they later additions? Certainly some Buddhist feminists believe they were. An enlightened teacher would never say that. But anyway, negative things crept into the tradition. And in certain countries that did not have higher ordination, kind of lesser forms of ordination emerged, kind of novice type forms of ordination. I mean, these are nuns in Burma. They haven't got higher ordination, most of them. They only a kind of 10 rule ordination. And scholars have called them contemporary nuns. In Sri Lanka also, that kind of 10 rule or 10 precept ordination was brought in at the beginning of the 20th century. And the nuns in Sri Lanka were called 10 precept mothers, dancers and martyrs. We didn't have a higher ordination, but monks had. So in this kind of context, what were the fruits of that 1987 conference? Well, yes, I was there, and I really saw women sharing their experiences of being a nun across traditions, including their experience of the conservative patriarchal elements in Buddhism. I saw women affirming that there should be no limitations on women in terms of what they could achieve. I saw the groundwork being laid for nuns across traditions and across countries to help each other. And an organization was formed called Sakya Dita, Daughters of the Buddha. Dita, daughters, Sakya, a word for the historical Buddha, Sakyan. And working groups were formed at that conference to tackle different issues, including social issues and also what we might call theological issues. But so there were formation of working groups, and it was a moment that shaped the history of Buddhism, I think. And a book came out of it, Daughters of the Buddha, edited by Carl H. Stillman. So the years that followed 1987, yes, more conferences were held: Bangkok 1991, Colombo 1993. National Sakyadhita groups were established. There's one in Britain, there was one in Sri Lanka where I was living at the time. And communication between Mahayana and Theravada nuns led to plans to re-establish eventually higher ordination in Theravada countries. And I'm now going to concentrate on some particular women, the women who kind of set up the conference, and other women as well. What are they doing, and how is their legacy being acted on? Yes, Venerable Karma Lecce Somo in 1987. She's still active, she's still going to academic conferences, she's still writing. She's been key to the development of Sakyadhita, and she went on not only to edit the book from that Sakyadhita conference, but also other books. I just mentioned one of them, published in 2000, Innovative Buddhist Women Swimming Against the Stream. She's got a very strong link with Tibet and has worked with the Tibetan nuns in Dharamsala and other places, and also insists that Buddhist women must be socially engaged, tackling the suffering of other women, particularly Buddhist women. And so even with this movement towards higher ordination for women, there has always behind it been a kind of socially engaged agenda, women actually doing things to improve the world. And Karma Lecce Somo has developed an academic role in the USA, teaching in universities there, and so on. So key to Buddhism, women are very kind of strong character. Ranjani de Silva. Now, I was asked quite some time ago to write on one Buddhist woman for a kind of edited collection on figures of Buddhist modernity in Asia. And I chose, I've given you the bibliographic reference there. I chose Ranjani de Silva because she's an amazing woman who is not known about. And she helped to change the mindset of Sri Lankans towards accepting higher ordination for women. At the Bodh Gaya conference, she volunteered for the social service training section. She helped to found Sakyadhita Sri Lanka, but she faced opposition even from Buddhist women. I mean, while I was living in Sri Lanka, I used to go to the meetings of Sakyadhita in Colombo, and I know that Ranjani and some of the women who were working around her even faced opposition from other Buddhist women because they felt she was going too far and eventually wanting higher ordination for women. One of the things that Sakyadhita Sri Lanka aimed at doing is to help the contemporary nuns, the Dasa Salmatas, the ones who follow 10 precepts, to be trained for social service in the village, so that they would not just be in their communities chanting, they would be working at the grassroots with people and empowering other women. And in 1991, she offered Colombo as the next venue for the Sakyadhita conference, and she in 1993, and she organized it meticulously.
बहुत स्लो है मेरे में आवाज
in social services and so forth. And after that conference, she painstakingly went around to try and get Buddhist monks to support the idea of higher ordination for women. She helped to, she established a training center, an institute for Buddhist women, and worked behind the scenes to enable ordinations in India in 1996 and 1998, eventually in Sri Lanka. So that in 2004, among 15 Buddhist women honored by the United Nations for their contribution to Buddhism, Ranjini De Silva was one of them. Now, I don't think there's time for me to go into the whole story of, of the higher ordination for women being brought back to places like Sri Lanka. I want to go to some other women. I want to go to Chatsuman Kabul Singh. This is her before she became ordained, because she became a nun as well. This is her. She's born in 1944. She's now. But in 2003, she became a nun. She got ordained in Sri Lanka, where higher ordination was possible again. And she became Venerable Dharma nun. And I visited her in her temple in Bangkok a few years ago, and she set up, a very, an innovative temple for women in Bangkok, for women who had gained higher ordination. And she's received quite a lot of criticism for actually gaining ordination, higher ordination as a Theravada nun. And this was a group that visited her temple. I'm there in the front there. It was an interreligious group that I was with in Bangkok. And yes, we went to visit her. And there's a story behind that Buddha image, but there's no time for me to talk about that now. So when she was Chatsuman Kabul Singh, she wrote quite a pioneering book when she visited the US, called Thai Women in Buddhism. And she put forward her own views about why there were negative texts about women in the Pali Canon, including distinguishing between core teaching and teaching that is affected by culture. She stresses that the texts are preserved by men with their own subjective standards of what was important. She claims that the Buddha could have been historically conditioned and could have got it wrong in some aspects, and so on. So pioneering the critical study of the Pali texts, and she's continued to do that. And now, yes, I think some of the conservative elements in Buddhism can't stand her, and there are groups of women that find her an absolute inspiration. Someone who's not there at the Sankadita conference, but who has been pivotal in kind of working for a Buddhism free of patriarchy. Rita Gross, born a Christian, converted to a Tibetan form of Buddhism, eventually became professor of comparative studies in religion at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. She saw herself throughout her life as a feminist, prolific writer on engaged Buddhist themes, how Buddhism can actually tackle the problems in the world, and was quite involved in Buddhist Christian encounter. And just one of her books, one of her first books was called Buddhism After Patriarchy. But I won't concentrate on that. I've only got a few minutes left. In 1998, again, quite a long time ago now, she wrote and published Soaring and Settling, Buddhist Perspectives on Contemporary Social and Religious Issues. And it was a personal testament. She was convinced that Buddhists should help to create a better future for the world. And she told her autobiography in it. How did she become what she was at that point? What principles flowed through this? And then she gave 7 essays that examined social and psychological issues, renunciation of overconsumption in our capitalistic world, and placing work first rather than community and friendship, then environmental issues. And her Her writing again has been an inspiration to many, but also a challenge to many who felt that she's, those who would want to see Buddhism as not patriarchal. Rita Rose pointed out and said, well, yes, there are many levels of patriarchy in the tradition, but Buddhist women can, this one, but Buddhist women can actually face this, confront this, change it. So the ongoing story, well, yeah, I've not got a lot of time, but quite a lot of research has happened in the last 20 years by other scholars. Alice Collett, who's a professor at St Andrews University, has written extensively on Buddhism and women, again trying to tell the positive story rather than the negative story. She's written on the lives of the early Buddhist nuns. She's also written on the research into inscriptions that she's done in India. She's found inscriptions that go back to the early centuries of Buddhism, which show that women were economically active. They were giving, they were supporting communities of Buddhist monks and nuns. They were independent, strong Buddhist women. And other research has uncovered the biographies of other powerful Buddhist women in history. In China, the queen, I think, who brought, the Buddhist queen who brought the printing press to China and so forth. So uncovering the biographies of powerful Buddhist women in history. Buddhist women teachers are becoming more prominent. If you look on the internet. One nun who's made a particular name for herself as a teacher in America is Pema Chodron. She was there in 1987 in Bodh Gaya. Nearly 40 years later, she's still teaching and is seen as a very strong spiritual teacher in the US. Sakyadhita is continuing its work, and its conferences have certainly often concentrated on the struggle for equal rights, on the need for women to be socially engaged, and so forth. And Sakyadhita conferences are still held. The last one was in Seoul in 2023, and I was looking at the records of this particular conference, and they say that 3,000 women registered for the conference, but on some days there were 5,000 present. So the next one, I think, is in 2025. I'm not sure where it's going to be, but yes, there is an impetus, and it brings again monastics. You see monastics and lay people there, and so on. So I would say that Buddhist women, the positive story is that Buddhist women are very active at the moment, but there's a long way to go in many different areas, because when Buddhism is often presented to the world in Sri Lanka, rows of male monastics, the women are not there. And even though higher ordination has been brought back to Sri Lanka, when I was in Sri Lanka earlier this year, in January and February, I linked up with some of the Buddhist nuns, with a group of Buddhist nuns, and there are a few thousand of them with higher ordination, but the government still does not recognize them, because there are some powerful Buddhist monks who would say, oh no, Theravada women cannot be ordained by Mahayana monks. So there's still a long way to go in empowering Buddhist women, but there's quite a lot happening. And I think I'll stop there.